Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Alexandra Ciobanu, and I am from Romania and live here in Milan. As our global population is steadily increasing, we will need to develop an agricultural market to support it, an expanded, efficient, and environmentally friendly one. This soon-to-be reality gives companies and firms an opportunity to innovate and advance, both technologically and strategically. Around 40% of the land on Earth is used for agriculture. However, there is still land that we could potentially expand production to. Africa owns about half of the world's uncultivated land, and a number of local firms are only steps away from taking advantage of it. We must invest in areas like these in order to harness their potential. Additionally, we must prepare to increase productivity and efficiency if we wish to reciprocate growing demand. Temperature sensors and robotic systems which reduce water waste, chemical use, and save time are only the beginning of the innovative movement needed in the agricultural market. On that note, with an expansion of this market and an increase in its production, we can expect growing levels of waste and pollution. However, we must strive to reduce them. Companies and firms more than ever must look to implement technology, to find strategies, and to ensure that we are not placing a strain on our natural resources. We are preparing to meet the future planet's needs in order to sustain it. However, this will not be possible if we do not also aim to sustain the planet itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to extend my particular thanks to the organizers. It's the first time I was proud of it today, because having been weighed on a scale, the group that weighed me said they would then add that weight to all the other people who got on the scale today and then go to a particular grocery store chain and they would say, this is the weight we want from you, from your produce that we can distribute to food kitchens. So first time ever I really felt good about my weight. Can we start the PowerPoint? There we go. I didn't know I had control of it. Thank you. Very quickly, I'm going to talk about some things about uncommon collaboration to tackle the grand challenges. And it's easy to look forward. It's very hard to understand where we have come from to the position we are today. So I'm going to start with some people I think that are really critical, and then end up in where I thought science fiction would never reach reality, but it has. So this is the status quo. All of you know about modern agriculture. You know that there's many scales, there's lots of erosion, there's modern cities, there's shanty towns. And then the maize that you see in this picture is completely inundated with aflatoxin, and I'll explain that later and why it's important to me. And this is the reality. There's 7.4 billion people in the world, and there's 7.4 billion food experts. Social media, as John Kerry said a few minutes ago, trumps science. Extremes dominate discussions, and traceability and transparency are key. And most people who you would talk to would basically tell you they distrust trade, globalization, specialists, and big data. So to give you an idea, to take a point that John Kerry made, and we did not coordinate our presentations at all, if you look at from 2004 to about 2013, every time you see a spike of significant nature in the cost of basic fundamental things like wheat, maize, etc., food riots came, and they caused what I would refer to as extreme responses in many parts of the world. And it's largely because certain crops failed due to bad weather conditions. And these are the four people inspiring Seeds and Chips. Those of you who don't know them should know them, because everything you will do is based on basically these four people. Frederick Sanger is one of the few people in the world who ever won the Nobel Prize twice in chemistry. Norman Borlaug won it in peace. Barbara McClintock won it in physiology or medicine. And Gerd of Kush is the winner of the World Food Prize. And I'll explain to you in a moment what they all represent. So seeds. I'm very interested in seeds. And I want you to think about this little video I'm going to show you. The seed in the video is 1/600th of a gram. 1/600th of a gram. It's not very much weight. But that's my hand, and that seed is 1/600th of a gram. You don't really think much about it. You really shouldn't probably. And the yellow you see is the germ in the seed, which is all the information. All the information that will take this in 2 months to this size. And again, 1/600th of a gram, all that information is encoded. And this is what it looks like 2,000 years later. This is the tree called General Sherman in Northern California. It's a giant redwood. But 1/600th of a gram inculcated all that information to have this tree grow for 2,000 years. So I happen to think seeds are profound. And when we think about human intervention in seed, what could be, whoops, let me go back. It's not supposed to start that, okay. This is teosinte. The seed is on the outside of the plant. This is the progenitor for all maize in the world. And when you think about what happened from this simple crop to modern maize, it's really profound. And when someone talks about interjecting an activity from teosinte to modern maize, think about the human actions that caused the selection over a 7,000-year period. And now for chips. A corn seed. This is what a single endosperm cell looks like. And this is a chromosome. And these are the scaffolds the chromosomes hang on to. And these are histones. And finally, DNA. Now, the reason I show you this, when those of my age started, we just would look at a cornfield and we would basically make selections and hope that we were smart. But today we can look at this because of the Sanger sequencer. And that's Sanger again, and on the far side, your left, my right, is the first Sanger sequencer, and on the far side is a room of BGI 5,000 sequencers in a town called Shenzhen, China. There's 450 of them in one room. They generate more output than almost any place else on earth every day. And the thing to remember, scientific research is one of the most exciting and rewarding of all occupations. So any of you who doubt what you're doing, think about Sanger, who won the Nobel Prize twice. And then indeed, the center of his life has been research. So I would not have been able to see what I showed you in that little video clip if I didn't have Sanger in my background. And because of that, I was able to decode the chocolate genome. This is the double helix dipped in chocolate. And in 2010, I produced the totally sequenced, assembled and annotated cacao genome with some partners. And this is what the partners look like. And the reason I put their names up there is this is the way you have to work today. Very few people in an ivory tower are going to make the breakthroughs that we need. And this is the great Norman Borlaug, a long colleague of mine. I worked with him starting in the late 60s. He was near Mexico City, and I was in the Oaxaca Valley. He was working on wheat. I was working on maize. He and a guy named Swami Nanthan were asked to solve a problem. In the old days, wheat used to grow this high. So when the winds would come to India and Pakistan, they would knock it over. It's called lodging. And so he was requested to breed a dwarf wheat which will only grow this tall. And for that, he won the Nobel Peace Prize because there's not an agricultural Nobel Award. And if you read what he said, civilization as is known today could not evolve, nor can it survive without an adequate food supply. Long before most people were talking this way, Norman was talking this way in the 60s and 70s. And food is the moral right of all who are born into the world, which leads into what, from Norman's input, began another track, and this is Gerd of Kush. And if you read what Gerd said, human hunger and desires are elastic, but land is not elastic. His point was that they're making more people every day, but they're not making any more land. So how do we take a big problem? Gerd is the world's greatest of all-time rice breeders, and this is hard to see. If I can get it to go forward. There we go. This is IR64. And I'm going to put my back to you just to look at this. This is what it takes to come up with this cultivar, IR64. The blue are the parents. So imagine all these crosses that had to happen to come up with that one line. IR64 feeds more people every day than any other crop in the world. It is the most popular rice ever. And he won the World Food Prize for that action. 37, 48, and 7. Anybody know what those numbers mean? 37, 48, and 7. 37% of the children under 5 in rural Africa are stunted. 48% of the children under 5 in rural India are stunted. And 7% of the children under 5 in the United States are stunted. I couldn't get a good number for the EU. That would have been my fourth number. Stunting. Everyone thinks it has to do with their small stature. But think about what you would want to do if you wanted to change stunting. So for me, it's nutrition for change. So stunting is height. Neurological, you never develop. So no one who is stunted will be in this room in the future because they wouldn't have the cognitive abilities. And economically, they'll never reach their potential. So this is a plague against humanity. And you can see in the bright red where the countries are at stunting. Africa and India are ground zero. So I formed a little thing called the African Orphan Crops Consortium to improve human health through making the traditional food crops of Africa more nutritious. We chose 101 food crops to work on. And this is the beginning of the diagram of how we were going to do that. To give you an idea of the complexity, governments and the African Union and international groups, intellectual property, all the things you can imagine, this was the first attempt at laying it out. This is the 101 food crops. I know it's hard to read. You can go to, if you look up the African orphan crops online. And then we realized it's great to do all this work, but who's going to take it out to the field? So we formed the African Plant Breeding Academy. And a week from Friday, this class graduates in Nairobi, 35 people, 18 women and 17 men, class 3. This little funny box right here is a HiSeq 4000 sequencer that we use for the lab. Because after you sequence everything, big data in petaflops, 101 reference genomes, each one resequenced 100 to 150 times. That means different cultivars of each one of these crops. You can do the math between 10,100 and 15,150 genomes. These are numbers that dwarf the imagination. So it's big data, BGI, the African Orphan Crops, will all be held by Google Genomics, which is the most advanced site that I know of in the world. All data will be held in the public domain under the auspices of the African Union. All of this work is done by donations to make sure that Africa has more nutritious food in the future. And this is the group. Talk about an oddball group of people who went together to do this. Academic, private, government, UNICEF, FAO. So this is what it takes to actually do an activity like this. You can't do it with less input because no one has the full expertise to do it otherwise. Barbara McClintock. Everyone in this room should read her Nobel laureate acceptance speech because she sort of gets at it here. If you know you're on the right track, if you have this inner knowledge, that nobody can turn you off no matter what they say. And I can assure you the male system of science in the United States at this time tried to turn Barbara McClintock off repeatedly. And she discovered a little thing called transposons. So imagine winning a Nobel Prize, and this is all you had to have to do it. This Indian corn and a simple microscope. And what she proved was something called inheritability. And from that way of thinking, I started looking at aflatoxin because I have a job, but I like to be busy. So aflatoxins are naturally produced. They're found in many crops, and they impact 4.5 billion people a year. It's a toxic food. It's a toxic fungus that implodes itself on food, both in the field and in storage. So I thought I'd take on storage first. These are the things it does. It causes children to be stunted, vitamin uptake, many, many health challenges you can imagine. So I launched on World Food Day in 2017, the Folded Aflatoxin Puzzle. And for those of you who are not familiar with Folded, it's a citizen scientist activity. So what the goal was, it's very simple. Aflatoxin B1, totally toxic. If I look at the 3DR2, and I make this one little simple move right there, in theory, I could hydrolyze it and have aflatoxin-free material. So this is how it happens. This is a screen from a live shot of how we fold proteins online. It's a game. You can see the moves we're making to try to reconstruct the protein, to create a new enzyme that will basically detoxify aflatoxin. Seems rather simple. 400,000 people played. We got 300,000+ puzzles solved. We're testing 100. Puzzle 2 is now up. This is the uncommon collaboration for that. And I'll finish now with this slide from Nelson Mandela, who many people have talked about this week here. As long as poverty, injustice, and gross inequality persist in our world, none of us can truly rest. So if you think about stunting, you think about lack of nutrition, you think about aflatoxin and the impact that it has on society, none of us should rest. None of us should even think about taking a rest. Because without solving these problems through innovation and uncommon collaboration, the future looks really quite bleak. Thank you.
They fixed it. Welcome for those of you who just joined us. I'm Helena Bodemiller-Evich, the Senior Food and Agriculture Reporter at Politico in Washington. I would like to invite the rest of the panel to come up for a discussion. We're getting some feedback, no? Yeah, wherever you want. Oh, good, we have enough chairs. It's always a gamble. So I'm delighted to be here this afternoon. We're going to be talking about sort of emerging trends and solutions in a more global context. We're going to look at food and agriculture and consumers, new investment, and all of the driving forces behind this moment of change that we're in. I have a really excellent panel. I have a large panel. We're going to encourage a lot of conversation here because we have so many people and so many insights to work in. I'm going to ask each of you to just sort of wave when I read your name. We have Daniel Nuremberg, the president of Food Tank. We have Tom Arnold, a member of the Global Panel on Agriculture and Food Systems for Nutrition. We have Timo Schmidt-Lord, head of Bayer Foundations. We have Case Arts, CEO of Protix. And we have Tania Pina, founder and CEO of Renewables. Did I get that right? We also, of course, have Howard. Welcome. And we have Robert Poole, lead on food and agriculture for KPMG in Australia. So, Robert, I'm going to start with you. You kind of have, your job is to look at this whole sector and figure out what's happening and make sense of it and advise experts and companies on what's happening. What do you see right now as the biggest driver of change? Like when someone asks you in an elevator, what's coming, what should we be focused on, what do you tell them?
Yeah, and thanks. Hi, everyone. And I think KPMG is sponsoring this session, so well done to KPMG Italy, and thanks for having me over. It's fantastic to be here. Look, the fact that I'm even sitting here shows you that the food sector has really got this buzz about it at the moment, and the fact that we would have partners in KPMG, traditionally a financial services audit and tax company. Now it's about management consulting, and food is really awesome and a great place to be. So really it's, commercially, the fact that we've got partners now in the big four firms just focused on food is a real trend change. I think what I would answer to your question is digital and China or Asia. They'd be the two. So I'm not relevant if I don't start talking about Asia or digital in the first few sentences. I'm really irrelevant. So China in particular, I mean, there's so many people there. They're all starting to get more income. They're all starting to eat more food as well as more highly valued food. So I definitely say Asia, China, digital. And interestingly, to follow on from Howard, what I was told when I was in China a few weeks ago is that they now consume more calories than the Japanese. So, they're actually starting, and they're not consuming more protein. They're way less protein. But so things like obesity and diabetes may actually start to come into the Chinese diet. But I'll leave it at that to give everyone else a chance.
It is certainly changing. Does anyone else want to weigh on that? Like, what is the thing that's driving the most change right now? I mean, there's so many different angles in food and ag.
I would just say climate change is, from my perspective, is driving so much of the innovation and sort of the reactionary responses that are happening in agriculture right now, because we're at a tipping point, a turning point, and people are looking for answers. And from my perspective, I think we can learn a lot about going forward by going back and looking at what farmers in the developing world have been doing to combat climate change for a long time now. I think there's always this tendency in the West to assume that we know how to teach the rest of the world about agriculture, but I think there's a lot to be learned from both South to South collaboration and also South to North collaboration. So I'd like to see more of that. That's one of the things I'm sort of keeping my eye on, not just climate change as this big issue that ag needs to deal with, but how we can encourage those uncommon collaborations and unusual partnerships that Howard described.
Yeah. Tania, tell us a little bit about what you're working on. I mean, what are you seeing? What's driving your world right now?
Sure. So Renewables is based in New York, and what we do is we focus on taking food waste, which is source separated from wholesale food distributors, and we turn it into a liquid nutrient line, both for indoor hydroponic cultivation as well as for soil. And so with that, the reason why we really got into this is with those farms, not only vertical farms, but those interested in just growing indoors in greenhouses for arid climates. It uses 90% less water, more resource efficient. We realized that we can create more thriving, biologically superior systems by using food waste extracts to reach a viable displacement or substitute for synthetics. What we've noticed is that, it's an emerging, very nascent market here in the US, but it's very entrenched in markets such as Dubai, India, Pakistan. The difference between the US is that we have the capital to invest in the infrastructure, whereas emerging markets, they really need to be creative with how these types of setups are started. So kind of leaning on what Danielle was saying is that the three major challenges that we try to address from a fertilizer perspective is really getting the attention of farms by addressing whether it's one, labor shortage, and we've seen that here in the US as well as abroad. Fertilizer is not a solution for that, but we can have a conversation about water shortages. And then third to that, if we can help reduce costs within their value chain, but optimize their farm as much as possible, then we really have a differentiator. So that's really what we try to do differently in our space.
Do we have all the technology we need to kind of make, like, if your vision were a reality and you had all the food waste and you created this like perfect loop system, I mean, do we have the technology we need to do that? Like, is it about buy-in and like, what's the barrier to doing that?
So food waste has, and maybe you agree
It's
or
just such a
disagree.
big problem.
It is, but I feel like we've been doing this for about like 5 or 6 years, many of those years spent on R&D, and it only really became like this sexy topic in the last 2 or 3 years,
Yeah.
if that.
Food waste is now sexy in the U.S. If you hadn't heard, it is officially sexy now.
Yeah, and you were asking about technology. I think, if investors as well as operators can think about every point of the value chain within the food system, whether that offset of byproducts from a food processor, right, can serve the nourishment needs of a developing country, if I may say that, and provide a source of enriched fiber or protein, for instance, that's where technology or innovation can really help meet that gap, as long as there is a viable a buyer at the other end of the market.
Interesting. So, Case, where do you come at this? What is your vantage point? What's driving all of this moment of change right now?
It's a big question.
It's a big question. We're starting
I'm
off
going to try
big,
to
so we can.
give a small answer. So I think what's driving change, obviously, is climate change, and for me as well, unfairness. And it was an extremely good expose on that. I think we've distributed nutrition unfairly, and that is now being exacerbated by climate change. So we need a wide range of technology innovations, regulatory framework innovations, and uncommon collaborations, as mentioned before. What we do is we have developed a string of technologies to produce insects at scale, affordably. We've invested over 75 million euro in the last 9 years. And we are now, as of today, have launched an egg in the Netherlands nationwide that has come from a chicken where we've been feeding live insects that have been grown on local food leftovers. And this way, you no longer need soy for the chickens to be fed, but you can do it with the proteins coming from the insects. So it's basically a complete protein circularity in the Netherlands.
So what kind of
That's what we
scale
do.
are you able to do? Is this
Well, we're already active in 12 countries with commercially available product, and a nationwide rollout of eggs. So
do you
that's
market them any differently? Like, are they
Yes.
high?
Well,
Do they have more omega-3s or whatever we market eggs for?
Well, what we market basically, I think, is this is a double win situation currently in the change of the food system. Is that there's no longer just two consumers. You used to have like the everyday carnivore and some small group of
Vegans.
activists,
Yeah.
right? But now you have like 20 or 40 types of consumers. You've got the Wednesday vegan, the Friday white meat lover, the Saturday vegetarian, flexitarian. So, and that's actually an immense opportunity. So it's already one of the biggest economies in the world, the food system, and then all of a sudden you get a diversification of consumers. I think that's beautiful, and that's also what we market. So what we market is, it's a very, very old-fashioned product, an egg, but we have a complete marketing framework around that. It's a primordial go back to nature, because chicken, actually what they do all day is they look for insects.
Look for bugs, yeah.
So all of a
They like
sudden now
bugs.
we have it. So that's what we've
okay.
marketed, and
All
it's
right,
at the prime spot in the national supermarket Albert in the Netherlands. So it's definitely something that appeals to the minds of an animal welfare-driven and sustainable product.
Interesting. Okay, Timo, I want to bring you in. We're going to keep going down the line, and then we're going to do gladiator battle on our panel here. What do you see driving change right now? What's the biggest driver for you?
I would say, as always for innovations, I mean, the challenge is the biggest driver for change. And particularly when we talk about food waste, to me, that's really kind of the biggest, how can I say it? I mean, it's kind of the biggest thing that goes wrong in the food industry. I mean, think about it. Yeah, we're talking about a $1 billion industry who is producing like 30% for the bin. I mean, could you imagine any other industry doing that? The car industry producing 3 cars and throw one straight away into the bin, not using it? It's insane, isn't it? And so the best strategy against food waste is probably not to produce the food that's going to be wasted, right? Then we don't need all these looping back and smart ideas to what to do with the wasted food, to not just throw it away, right? And so tech innovation can actually help quite a bit to do exactly that. I've been yesterday to an event with a chap from London, which we support in the Bayer Foundations. They are producing smart fishing devices, so it's a lightening device called Safety Net. They found out in an old Nature paper from the 60s that all fish species are selective to a specific light spectrum. And in the 60s, the professor who found that out really just couldn't use that information. No one was interested. No one did really care about food waste at all in the 60s. So no one was using it. And they actually found this old information, and they are building these lighting devices now. They are stick to fishing nets, and let's say if they turn them on gray, they only catch tuna, right? And all the other fishes do not swim in the net. So they can reduce bycatch to almost zero. And bycatch is the biggest issue of overfishing the ocean. So if you don't have bycatch, you don't have the overfishing anymore, right? So what I see in the food industry, that we are actually optimizing in a tiny area of the industry on the wrong way, and we are actually completely like losing out the real potentials that are out there because we are not introducing the hidden innovators who are actually developing out of a challenging situation the crazy cool new answers.
That's fascinating. I hadn't heard of the lights, and that it's an old idea is kind of fascinating.
It's just one example of at the moment we are invested in about 15 like food innovation tech projects around the globe, and it's always these. I mean, look into the smallholder farmers, 400 million smallholder farmers, and they have really like, they do agriculture like, I don't know, 200 years ago, right? So they are not productive. If we would actually increase the productivity of smallholder farmers, you could straight away forget about how to feed the world, because these people would feed the world because they are actually working everywhere. They are just only working under such insane bad conditions, right?
Right.
And this is actually the area where we could really do like a big disruptive change.
Interesting. So Howard, I want to come back to the how to work across sectors and drive change. I think that's a fascinating example of trying to boost nutrition and the crops that are available in Africa. But what do you see, independent of your trailblazing work, what do you see happening? Like, what is the biggest sort of trend that you're watching? Because you have a really good global vantage point. A trend that you're not driving. How's that?
Well, I think at this juncture, the use of artificial intelligence is going to leapfrog almost everything we're talking about, because the ability with 97, 98% accuracy and predictability of a certain cause factor relationship is going to happen very quickly. The ability to write algorithms to predict disease in trees from a satellite going 25,000 miles an hour with 24 sensors on it, including LiDAR and radar, is going to change the way we look at land, the way we look at production. The other thing is, I applaud finding a paper from 1960 in Nature. It's so brilliant that we went back and looked, because so much science has been driven over by the desire to collect new published papers, get promotions.
People want the headlines.
They do want the headlines, but how come no one has cracked nitrogen fixation in plants? This is the holy grail. I mean, the comment about nitrogen or fertilizers, what if we had a plan like we had to put a man on the moon for nitrogen fixation globally? Just imagine nitrogen fixation pulled out of the atmosphere. It's the most abundant place on Earth to get nitrogen. Don't make it. Just absorb it. So plants that need it, plants that don't get enough of it, plants that already have it but would grow better. And then the keystone point that I think that you made, you've got this mass of small farmers who live in abject, grotesque poverty. They're undernourished. They have no money. They're living on less than 56 cents a day writ large. What does it take to move that whole piece over to good, from horrible to good? I'm not even talking about excellent. So if you look at the chickpea farmer in India, they produce 900 kilos per hectare, largely because of genetics. They don't have good germplasm, or they don't have the best germplasm. Canada is 2,000 kilos per hectare. Ethiopia, which is the mother lode of all chickpeas, they do almost 2,000. So how come we can't work together and get India up to 2,000 and change the livelihoods of those people. And the other piece that I never hear talked about on a regular basis is benefit sharing for the people who have kept those materials alive, like the Ethiopian farmers that are now going to lend that germplasm essentially to India. What is the benefit to them? So there needs to be a system for benefit sharing. The Nagoya Protocol actually has to work at this point.
Fascinating. Tom, do you want to weigh in here?
Can I add a sentence? Because it
Yes.
just fits so well. Just another project we support in Kenya. Kenya, they have in some areas in Kenya, they have one of the just best soil in the world. They could really grow everything there, right? They lose 45% of their harvest on the way to the markets because they're traveling like with a bicycle without any cooling chain, nothing else whatsoever. And there's a local startup we support. They produce e-bikes with a solar panel and a cooling box in the back, where the smallholder farmers can actually bring the harvest without any loss at all completely to the market. That is a tremendous increase in their income. Even if they have low harvest, they bring them completely to the marketplace.
If I could just make one more quick point. 45 trillion gallons of water are lost in food waste every year. 45 trillion. I mean, John Kerry was talking about big numbers too. But imagine if you don't lose that water, how much could be used for other things if there was no loss there?
And I would call that, you actually took on the terminology of science fiction a couple of times before. I would call that social fiction. It's really like applying the technology to make the world the place in which we could have a better life and a more progressive life, instead of going to the moon and grow vegetables over there.
Yeah.
Tom, do you have a mic?
Oh, can we borrow your mic?
Yeah. We're going to get everyone in first.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So what do you want to ask me?
So, well, we were talking yesterday about this problem of not addressing problems holistically. Do you think that in this moment of change we're in and all this flux, do you think that we are getting better at addressing, we were talking about nutrition and agriculture and sort of looking at it in the big picture, as all this change is happening? Do you think we're getting better at doing that?
Possibly, but not yet. I think the biggest problem, or one of the biggest problems, is the changing nature of malnutrition and the impact that's having not just on people's availability of food, but on health and increasingly on the climate issue. And finding solutions to that, I think, is our big challenge. And it's going to have to be addressed along the lines that Howard spoke about. But if we can learn lessons from the last 10 years, 10 years ago, you saw on Howard's, one of his early slides, a graph of food prices. And 10 years ago, we had what was called the food price crisis. Rapid increases in food prices, rapid increases in the number of hungry people, and suddenly food was back on the political agenda again. But it also combined at that time with some important scientific insights. The Lancet in particular had a paper which spelled out the costs of undernutrition. The costs in terms of mortality, so it accounts for 45% of child deaths under 5, and the cost in terms of stunting. And up till then, the issue of stunting and the long-term effects of stunting was not really being talked about. So now you had a combination of politics and science working together, and you've had over the past 10 years some serious progress in dealing with the issue of undernutrition. 10 years ago, we talked about malnutrition and we meant undernutrition. Now, I think we more increasingly understand that malnutrition has got indeed the undernutrition component. It has got the component of micronutrient deficiency, and to an increasing degree, we have the problem of overweight and obesity. And how to crack this problem with science and with political will is at the heart of the challenge we face. And I think the best way of thinking about this is the way described yesterday by Gunhild from the EAT Foundation. And she spoke about the 3 C's. She talked about connections. So the need to connect diet and food with health and with climate. She talked about consensus, the need to work towards a consensus about what to do about this problem. And the Lancet EAT Foundation report, which is coming out later this year, I hope can begin to start creating that consensus. And then she talked about collaboration. And here we're back directly into what Howard was speaking about, finding the appropriate collaborations to deal with the appropriate problem.
You know, it's fascinating that I think in Washington, you are starting to hear people talk about hidden hunger more, just as a concept that it's not necessarily stunting you see, it is the stunting you don't see that is the most, alarming in terms of like the long-term prognosis. And I think one of the ways I'm starting to hear it talked about more is if you are helping countries develop their food, their ag policy, have nutrition be part of that conversation from the get-go, because so often, because I cover food policy and ag policy, they're in separate rooms, they're in separate silos. The ag people don't know the nutrition people don't really think about ag, and vice versa, which is just so common and also kind of crazy when you think about how directly tied they are. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about kind of like the big picture flow of like capital, both in terms of startup investing and also foundation money, what we're seeing. Case, I want to start with you. Like, where are you seeing any slowdown, pickup, any sort of trend in how much capital is flowing to food and ag right now? Are you able to raise all the money you need, is my question. Yeah.
Yes, we've been quite successful in raising the money we need. In excess of 75 million. Last round last year was 45 million, one of the largest round in the food ag globally. Also with a good mix of equity and lease and loans, which is exceptionally unique for a young company building assets. I think in general the capital markets for young companies is tilted towards low marginal cost businesses like software and technology. So ag tech innovations demand usually a long time period, a capital intensive asset build up and a good knowledge of supply chains. So in general, capital is fairly impatient these days, but I do see a trend moving back to it because it's also a relatively secure long-term investment, right? The chances that the food economy will shrink is 0 to none, right? It's actually a very exciting growing business. And with the growth rate of impact investment also moving and joining forces with the regular capital markets, I actually see a bright future for many ag tech innovations. I do see still a bit of a lagging area in Europe, even though the highest success rate of technology and innovation and patents, for instance, comes from the EU actually. So that could improve, but in general I see a positive trend for investments in ag tech.
Want to weigh in on what they're seeing? Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's kind of what we're meant to do for a living. So we probably
yeah,
should
where's
comment.
the money? Where's it coming from?
Yeah, it's there's a few different answers to it. I mean, there is a lot of capital flowing, and as I said, it's officially sexy to invest in agriculture. I mean, I think the ag tech stuff's pretty new still, but the big money, look, is it going into the farm sector? Not as much as it should be. I think they're still quite scared of volatility, and with climate change coming in, I don't think the big pension funds and the big super funds around the world are still that comfortable with farming as an investment. I think that's definitely something we need to work on. They like the big sort of corporate food processing companies, the big brand owning companies. They're all still pretty easy to sell. You could sell them a million times. So the flow of capital is good, but yeah, the farm sector still needs to attract a lot more capital. And if anything, it's still, I think, not sure what the rest of the panel thinks. Maybe Tom's got a comment, but I don't think people still are that comfortable investing in farming.
And yet it seems like a lot of people agree that ag's so ripe for disruption, if we're going to use that term, because
yeah, it just doesn't make
it's hard.
Doesn't make don't make a lot of money.
Yeah.
And however, I think in Silicon Valley, it's the only topic that's really discussed anymore is agriculture and ag invention. And there was an innovation meeting that I presented at that long ago, 900 people in the room.
Wow.
Most of them looking for the next thing. And there was many presenters who had meetings, these one-offs, organized every annual year by a big bank and a big IP firm, putting it together. And I was dumbstruck at how much money was in the room.
Wow.
And
Yeah,
if you look, if I would just make one other example, Google for many years had something called Solve for X. Solve for X was a pitch where over 3 days, about 30 things were pitched. And every major investment firm in Silicon Valley, when I talk about Silicon Valley, it's really a misnomer. It really is all the way to San Diego. So it's San Diego to Seattle is the new Silicon Valley, because that's where the money's coming from. And of the pitches made, half were about ag, but Mark Andreessen was in the room, all the Google investors were in the room, Kalsa was in the room, all the really the billion-dollar portfolios. They're just raising their hand, you know, can I talk to you at lunch? And they were investing literally on the spot. The danger with that is it's helter-skelter. And they don't have necessarily the science to go along with their enthusiasm. And I think I think going back to what you were saying, there's a disappointment cycle. Yeah. And what we need to do as a community is change it from a disappointment cycle to a realistic cycle. And there needs to be an understanding, out of 10 projects that go forward, 6 are going to fail. It's just the nature of the beast. It's been going on in high tech for 30, 40 years, so why should we be any different? But they want us to push the boundaries. They want us to see the future, and that's what they want to invest in.
And Howard and I had a chat last night, and I certainly agree with him. I think there's plenty of venture capital there, and they're trying to get in early and make big multiples. Right. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, you know, when you're owning stainless steel and you're owning factories and you're owning farmland, that's still hard work. Yeah. But, you know, they're very, very excited about the new breeding technologies, etc., and they do want to invest in that sort of stuff.
But it's interesting too, because those investors, one would assume, have no expertise in food and ag, are probably 2 generations removed from living in a rural community or working on a farm. So it's kind of it's just an interesting, because it's very different than, as you know, from apps or software or Uber. I mean, it's just a totally different
I don't see, it's
sector.
not a big difference, I guess, because the people do not invest in what I sense in these like Silicon Valley pitch things. They don't invest in the farming. They invest in the idea to overcome a shortcoming in the farming industry. Yeah. They invest into tech innovations. And what I also see in all these investors is that they change this super overdone margin orientation like we've seen in the past, and for instance in the pharma industry, and shifted very much to a purpose-driven, like what's the societal value perception in the finance industry, which is definitely the way to go, because when you look back into what happened, for instance, in the past in the pharma industry, I would say margin orientation in the finance industry kills people, because it actually hinders like the industry to sell products as a market price that is affordable to the people, let's say for instance in Africa, because the finance investors only look on the margin. Right. And luckily in the farming innovation industry, I don't see that trend.
Just to add in one last point, there's a lot more corporate strategics getting in a lot earlier than in the past. So you have Land O'Lakes, you have Conagra, Pepsi, Coca-Cola, all making very formidable steps to integrate technology within their existing platforms much sooner, for benefits such as, you know, if agronomists can be able to disseminate a lot of their information to the farms that they're consulting for much sooner, and it's already within a brand, you know, whether it's the fertilizer supplier, whether it's the OEM component within their farm system, if they can get it in much sooner, then these strategics are much more willing to invest in a seed stage or Series A stage company than they were in the past.
Interesting. Does anyone else have thoughts about capital?
I just say, when we talk about land as a fixed commodity, they're very interested in land. They may not be interested in driving tractors, the investment community, but they are making big investments in land. Let's take Africa aside for a moment, because some of the pernicious activity there coming out of the East and out of the Middle East is complicating things. But the ability to interface with large productivity is really becoming very keen. And whether we like precision agriculture or not, the decisions you can make on a piece of land and I'm talking about 500 to 1,000 hectares, but equally for a 2-hectare plot, is going to be the real shift in the next 2 or 3 years to be able to disseminate that through smartphones. And while we were getting ready to start our panel, I was looking out in the room. Every single person in this room was on their smartphone. You go to Africa, everyone has a semi-smartphone. So it's almost better to give them away if we're trying to really increase the capability of farming, like you talked about, of the hundreds of millions of smallholders. So they have every bit of information they need. They take a picture of a plant, it goes up to the cloud analyzes, says you have a sulfur shortage, or you put too much nitrogen on, or you're getting something uptake, which is a bad thing. Here's how you ameliorate it. That will happen in 5 years instantly.
I would actually like to add this to this land is limited idea. Land is not this limited as we think, I have to say, because we're using only 10% of the globe as farming land, and 80% of that farming land we're using to actually grow crop for cattle feeding, which is insane waste of land actually, because if we would actually come up with solutions like producing algae in ponds in the desert, something like that, to do cattle feeding, all the land would be like free and available for vegetable breeding. So land is not this limited as we always think it is.
That's always interesting to
It's a way of how we use it.
Right. It's always interesting to sort of challenge the assumptions that we use.
And I agree with that. I think intensification is going to be massive. And you look at the Netherlands, I think we might have some Dutch people on the panel, at least one. And you know what they produce out of the Netherlands is incredible. I mean, the second biggest food exporter behind the US. Who would have known that? I could have quizzed everyone except the Dutch. I think the point about iPhones is a great one. I think people are going to skip whole generations of technology in developing countries, because if you go to China now, the credit card sort of never really existed in China. They've gone straight to the iPhone as their main form of. So WePay now is dominant as a form of payment in China. So they've sort of jumped a whole credit card generation. I still have a wallet full of them. And, so those kinds of things, I think Howard is right. They're very, very exciting. I think the big challenge and why I'm so fascinated with China is that if you look at beef consumption, everything might say that for the climate that we should cut back beef consumption. But the Chinese love beef. Beef consumption in China is going to have 6-7% compound growth over the next 10 years. And the amount of beef that the world is going to be expected to produce is actually going to hugely go up.
Yeah, so maybe your cattle feed idea is, you can maybe need to change what we...
Well, it's just a huge challenge for us because,
Or it's going to get a lot more expensive.
The demand side is going to be there for a lot more beef.
Right. There is this whole buzz around plant-based foods, but if you look at, people are not eating less meat. Americans are not eating less meat. They're eating more dairy. I mean, it's sort of a...
And the Chinese are going to eat 50% more.
Right. So I want to do something a little bit different. We don't have very much time left, but so often at these conferences, I feel like we talk about all of these things that are going to happen and these predictions. I want some ideas of what you guys think is overhyped. We talk about these trends. What is a trend that we talk about that is just not scalable, but people talk about it like it's the next big thing. It's going to drive global change. Is there a trend that you're
Before we get into that, can I express some frustration? I think, it's exciting what we've talked about on this panel. I think, these emerging technologies are, for an agricultural nerd like me, are so cool. But what farmers need in the developing world, what the 500 million small farmers need, is basic infrastructure in many cases. And we're talking things like roads. And I think, that often gets dismissed in these conversations. And, while it's great that so many amazing companies are taking the lead on these unusual collaborations, we also need governments, and particularly governments in sub-Saharan Africa and also the US government, to step up to the plate and push for these investments and reinvest in small farmers. So I would have liked to see a Minister of Agriculture or a farmer on this panel as well to speak to that, because I think we're missing something really big here.
Yeah, we were talking about this,
I think that's fine. I think it's fine to say that. Yeah. However, if you have a decentralized food system like you have in sub-Saharan Africa, what you need is nutrition in the plants that they eat every day. When the roads come, they will come. But if you're in a negative nutrition situation, not food security, the word should be nutrition security, that's true. But if you had the right plants to eat with the right combinations, you would ameliorate a lot of the problems. You would increase the wealth capability of those people and the cognitive function of those people. The roads will come. But I think just to talk about roads and getting a supply chain worked out is a misnomer till you fix the bottom part of the pyramid.
Well, it kind of reminds me of like, what good is an app if you don't have clean water, or like a way to transport your product, or currency for transactions, or right.
It's not just seeds,
Right.
and it's not just the plant, it's
And
the soil itself.
we actually talked about this on my panel yesterday as well, just in general, and this is not just a criticism of this conference, of all food conferences, tends to be a big lack of farmer perspective at these meetings. It's something that I think the whole food and ag community sort of struggles with. Even the ag policy conferences a lot of times don't include farmers. So it is definitely a blind spot, and I think it's a blind spot that more people are talking about now. Yeah. Go ahead, Tom. Weigh in. Yes.
I think we've heard a bit of some of the potential that modern technology is going to bring for production agriculture, but I think what we haven't spoken about really is the fact that current food systems in a number of countries, particularly developing countries, are giving rise to bad outcomes. Bad outcomes in health, long-term problems being stored up in public health and consequently public finances. And politicians are going to have to begin to take this more seriously. And they're going to have to be pushed to take it more seriously by consumers and citizens.
Yeah.
And business is going to have to examine its conscience about the contribution it's making to the negative outcomes from food systems. And that's a debate that is going to have to take place, the balance between regulation by government and self-discipline by business. And we haven't touched on it here today yet, but I think it's one of the big issues in the future.
Yeah. You want to weigh in on that? Yeah.
I think without answering to what are the overhyped, underhyped, or non-hyped innovation, I think there's another way of looking at it, is that the diversity of the food system is the opportunity itself. So there's a report on the innovation with a purpose by the World Economic Forum, which I'm on the Council on Food Security, and it basically gave an overview of enabling technologies that can innovate on a regulatory level, on a societal level, and on a commercial business level. And the beauty about the food system, that every geography has its own application and technology framework potential. So yes, it's a myriad of options, and there needs to be uncommon collaborations from regulatory levels all the way to business and societal. But I think when you take that lens, a food system lens, with the myriad of opportunities, then I think many of the things described today might not happen as described, but they might have a very fertile future in different environments. So I'm actually quite optimistic about the wide range of opportunities in the food system at large.
Interesting. Does anyone else have any thoughts about things you hear about that are not scalable? Like, good example for me, I'm skeptical of like cricket flowers, but the egg thing I think might be like an interesting scalable solution, because a consumer might be more apt to try that, but I don't know. I mean, it's not that there's obviously some really cool products with insect protein in them, but as far as like being a solution to like the protein needs of the world, I sometimes hear that and go, I don't know, like if that's really gonna happen, but. Because you have to remember, consumers have to eat it, right?
I think you actually gave part of the answer yourself, right? So one is you doubt one part of the solution, but you give a positive connotation to another part. I think that's I think the part of the food system innovation. Not all will succeed, but as with many consumer products, it's a total offering of the price, the packaging, the solution, the story, and everything needs to be in unison in order to be successful. So there will definitely be failures, but I think there will be far more successes in the coming decades than we expect.
Yeah, I mean, my only comment is I think people tend to take an overly Western view of all this. I think it's the same issue in climate change as well, that unless you can contemplate China and India in particular, and increasingly Africa in the future, we're really not going to solve anything. So I think as Australians, if I can put ourselves down for a minute, we live in this awesome country far away from everything else, and we think that we might do something locally that's going to make a difference. Well, I applaud people for doing that, don't get me wrong, but we really have to contemplate China, India and Africa in whatever we do. Hence my example about beef production, because I think a lot of people would assume beef production is going to fall in the world and that beef consumption is going to fall.
I cannot agree
but,
more.
That we need to contemplate.
Right, and you're
that
not going to
challenge.
convince them to eat crickets instead of beef. Like, you're not personally on that campaign.
Well, I think it's great. In fact, I'm supporting some people who are doing insect stuff in Australia.
I'm not trying to hate on insects.
But all I want to do is make sure we put the focus. It's like John Kerry said, put it in the right context, put it in the facts, and make sure we contemplate Asia and Africa and India in that.
Go ahead.
Cannot agree more. I mean, if we are up for like solving the issues of the raising billions, we have to have like solutions where the billions are. The billions are neither in Australia, nor are they in Europe, nor are they in the US. The billions are in Latin America, in Africa, India and China, and there we have to innovate and come up with the new solutions to make a change that matters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead. I'm not sure. It says we have a couple more minutes, but the clock's counting both directions. So flag me if we're... I'm going to keep going, yeah. But just flag me if we need to stop. Yeah.
One thing we also should not forget are trees.
Yeah.
Trees are one of the great sources of food, nutrients, vitamins, particularly the micronutrients that Tom was talking about. And I think you really have to consider that we don't really think much about improving trees. We spend a lot of time improving maize and soybeans, rice, wheat, what have you. But in many parts of the world, when everything else fails, people eat tree crops, whether it's nuts or oilseed or what have you. And of the African orphan crops, of the 101 crops, 37 are trees.
Interesting. Does anyone have any? Are we out of time or no? It counted to 0, so I'm just making sure. Anyway, we'll keep going. So looking at social media's role in all of this and just the changing dynamics, both in terms of what consumers are demanding and also like what technology consumers will accept. I'm curious if any of you think that consumers overall are going to move to a place where they're more accepting of technology and its role in food and agriculture, or are we moving away from it? So like the GMO labeling example is a good one. We had this backlash over GMOs in the US, so now we're going to be labeling them. However, if you actually look at, it hasn't really changed sales that much. Like the vast majority of consumers are buying what is affordable and what is tastes good and what they're used to. But now we're facing down, gene editing and this whole new wave of change and innovation. I'm curious what the panel's thoughts are on how that's likely to go with consumers.
I think the more beauty is a solution, the better the consumers will like it. I mean, in principle, the society is open for technology. I mean, that's the only way I can see it when I look into how we use tech in our normal life nowadays, right? And maybe we're not good in like communicating how beautiful the tech innovations in food are and how innovative they are to make them appealing to the broader public. Maybe that's the issue, because everyone likes like health innovations to make life of people better, but no one really thinks about food innovations to make the life of people better. Why is that? So why are we not actually showcasing the beauty of the innovations?
Mm-hmm. Danielle, you look like you had some.
I think the question for me is, and I don't mean to be sort of pivoting again, but I'm pivoting.
Go ahead.
I think the question is who is in control of technology? I think consumers got very scared of GMOs because they didn't understand who was controlling them. And so I think we have this opportunity now to really present technology in a way that informs consumers. There's a lot of transparency, there's a lot of information, but they know who's controlling it, they know who it's benefiting, they know what problem it's trying to solve for. I don't think that comes up enough in these conversations. What problem are we trying to actually solve for? And I think the more information that consumers have, and the more that we introduce this idea of true cost accounting in the food system, and look at both the positive and negative externalities of both food production and consumption, we can negate some of these concerns that consumers have, because they'll have full information in a way that they haven't ever had before. And 20 or 30 years ago, when GMOs were first
But it's really a funny thing, because when we talk about food innovations, then we talk about GMOs, which is a decade-old technology. It's not really innovative, right?
40 years old.
40 years old. So when we talk about the future of food,
right.
and then we come up with like people don't like GMO, that's really what the wrong discussions we have, right? I mean, we should really talk about
I think it's
really
more, what do
like.
we learn from it? What do we learn from that example?
That's fine. But actually, that was not the point you were making. So, yeah,
Yeah.
that's quite
But I think there's a subtle point here.
Yeah, yeah.
Everyone complained because GMOs were demonized very quickly by a couple of activist organizations. It's fine. They did well in their job. But almost anyone who has diabetes who takes medicine, it's a GMO medicine. Almost any cheese has a GMO rennet in it. Almost any wine has a GMO yeast in it. Almost any beer has a GMO yeast in it. So we can be very selective. And in the area of gene editing, this is the most democratized thing that has happened in this area in maybe 50 years. At the campus at UC Davis, where I'm associated, there's probably 12 to 16 labs doing CRISPR. Go down the street to Berkeley, there's at least 10 labs doing it. Stanford, another 20. UC San Francisco. So this is a democratized technology that nobody can say, I own this. There's some big patent fights about it. It makes no difference. It's the cat's out of the bag on a CRISPR.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be an interesting space to watch. I'm being told that we are now out of time. I think, you know, as we are just in this moment of like so many new terms and consumers having to accept and learn about this new landscape, it's going to be interesting to watch how gene editing plays out. And maybe the cat's out of the bag, and we'll just see all of these new products, and everyone will accept them, and it will be smooth. I don't know. We'll have to see. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Thank you.